We have to think about every stage of the criminal justice system. So from the moment when laws are passed by our legislatures, what sorts of laws they're passing, are there differences in sentencing for people who are arrested for use of and possession of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine? And why is there that difference? Why is it that someone who cheats on their taxes gets audited in an uncomfortable process and is not thrown into prison, but somebody who steals in another way from our society is thrown into prison? What are the differences in the ways that we think about the crimes and who we associate with the crimes that affect the policy decisions at the very beginning? Then we need to think about where does policing happen, who gets arrested and why they get arrested, who gets charged and why they get charged, and what do they get charged with. How are sentences formulated? Right now we have mandatory minimum sentencing in many states and in the federal level, and the mandatory minimum sentencing takes away the discretion of judges to see the nuance of a case and to see the mitigating circumstances of a case. And instead they're handed a grid that said, okay, this is a Class C felony and this is your third offense, and following the grid, that's 5 years. And so there's very little opportunity for judges to make discretionary decisions. Now, in some level, that's good, because there have been records in our history of judges making discretionary choices that were based in racial bias. But at the same time, the way that the guidelines are set up actually end up harming certain groups of people more than other groups of people. Then we need to think, after sentencing, what do our sanctions look like? Criminological data about prisons suggests that they actually increase recidivism rates. If prisons increase recidivism rates, they're actually not making our communities safer. We're spending a lot of money on a remarkably ineffective practice in order to make our neighborhoods an okay place to live. Plus, 95% of people who are in prison and jails will return to our communities. The question is, do we want them to return to our communities having been harmed, abused, isolated, and excluded, or do we want them to return to our communities prepared to become productive citizens, neighbors that we would want to live next to, members of our churches? And we're not doing that. But there's hope, because there are practices that have been shown to actually increase, to better enable offenders to become full participants in our society again. The first of those is restorative justice. And restorative justice takes many different forms, and different forms have different levels of effectiveness. But on the whole, data suggests that restorative justice practices can reduce recidivism up to 7%, which is small, but considering that prisons increase recidivism and restorative justice is a lot cheaper than prison, it would be a better way to invest our money to turn to restorative justice. The other thing that is hopeful are certain rehabilitation programs. And I want to be careful to say not all rehabilitation programs do this. And just because a program says that it's rehabilitative does not necessarily mean that it's rehabilitative. Things like chain gangs have been labeled as rehabilitative. So let's not get confused about just because someone says something's rehabilitative or even restorative, that it is in fact rehabilitative or restorative. But criminologists have shown that rehabilitation that is directed toward offenders according to the appropriate level of risk, that they will reoffend according to the appropriate seriousness of the offense that they committed, and that are responsive to their particular needs, can reduce recidivism up to 26% in a residential or prison setting. In a community setting, they can reduce recidivism up to 35%. And they're still a lot cheaper than prison. So we need to think about ways in which we can reduce our prison populations and offer resources for rehabilitation and restoration for all offenders. There will be some people who will not use those resources. There will be some people who will continue to be a danger to our society. So prisons are still going to continue to be a reality for us, and I think we do need them. The question is, do we need over 2 million people in our society in America's jails and prisons in order to achieve public safety? And I think the evidence is pretty clear that no, that's not the case. Some people get nervous about restorative justice, and their nervousness tends to be around issues of, is this being too soft on crime? I think the key is, in thinking about that, is to take a step away from actually thinking about justice as always dictated by rules. The rules are important. We don't want to get rid of the rules. We want to keep the laws. The laws provide order, and they help us know where the boundaries are. Laws aren't perfect, though. Laws will inevitably fail in terms of responding to the particularities of each circumstance. So Aristotle, and then later Aquinas picks this up, but it's also a theme throughout the Christian tradition. What Aristotle says is that justice responds to the particularities of a case, that you can't generalize about all cases. You need to be able to enter into what happened, who are these people, what's their story, in order to know fully what's there. And when that happens, when you learn somebody else's story, you're more likely to be open to mercy. He observes that when we have both justice and mercy, that when people enter into the particularities of a person's case, they're much less likely to demand the highest degree of punishment for that person, and instead to invoke some level of mercy. It's incredibly rare that we have the case that we enter into the particularities of someone's story and demand more punishment than would otherwise be warranted. So what mercy does, and what listening to the stories of others does, is soften the edges of law so that we're better able to think of ways in which the law doesn't quite meet the situation. It gives us some guidelines, but it doesn't fully describe the particular situation. And given that, we can use the law as a base, but can also say, here are other things that we ought to do instead. So with restorative justice, what that does is provide a space for listening to the story of the other. Listening to the story of the offender, listening to the story of the victim, and listening to the stories of community members. In doing this work with restorative justice, I've seen a lot of people then begin to recognize the humanity of the person sitting across the table from them. Both the victim recognizing the humanity of the offender, and the offender recognizing the humanity of their victims. I was in one case in which a 14-year-old young man stole 14 cars. None of his victims were able to come to the restorative justice conference, but his grandmother was there, and there were community members there. And it came time to talk about who is it that is harmed by the stealing of 14 cars, and what's it like to have your car stolen. And none of the community members had ever had a car stolen. So we were having a hard time being able to explain this to a 14-year-old, what the implications of this are. And then the grandmother said, well, I had my car stolen when you were a baby. And I had just gone to the grocery store and I lost $200 worth of groceries. And I loved that car. And it was a Dodge Dart and I had saved up for it and it was my car. And they stole it and they took all the food and they destroyed the car and it was never the same again. And the kid said, oh, he didn't know that he was harming his grandmother when he was stealing the cars, or someone like his grandmother every time he did that. And in recognizing it, that's the pain of the punishment that's necessary. That's the pain that he then was able to say, I need to turn this around and do something else. And it's hearing that story that gave him that sense of compunction that opened up new possibilities for him being in the world. But also in hearing his story and why he stole the cars, that his parents had been divorced, he didn't have any supervision at night, he was lonely, he didn't have friends, and there was one slightly older teenager that led him on that way. That we were then able to say, you know, for stealing 14 cars, you should be in juvenile detention. But actually, given this, what you really need is some guidance. What you really need is a mentorship. What you really need is to be in closer relationship with your grandmother. And so to find other possibilities for how to think about how will this young person be restored to us in a way in which he can be a full member of our community again, rather than how can we exclude and isolate him in ways that will likely lead to more exclusion and more isolation, more crime, and more harm done to people in the future.